What if the most powerful secret in human history has been buried beneath one of the holiest places on earth for nearly 1,000 years? In the year 1119, 9 knights descended into the ruins beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and stayed there for 9 years. They told no one what they were looking for. They told no one what they found. But when they finally emerged, everything changed. Within decades, those 9 men had become the most feared, the most wealthy, and the most mysterious military order the world had ever seen. Popes bowed to their influence. Kings borrowed their gold. Entire armies trembled at their reputation. And then, just as suddenly as they had risen, they were destroyed. Arrested in a single night across an entire kingdom, tortured into confession, burned at the stake, and officially erased from history. But secrets this deep do not stay buried. Because what those knights found beneath the Temple of Solomon was not just a relic or a treasure. It was something so powerful, so threatening to the established order, that it had to be silenced. And the men who silenced it feared it enough to commit mass murder to do so. This is the story of the Knights Templar, of what they found, what they built, what they knew, and why the world could not allow them to survive. Before the Templars, there was the Crusade. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and delivered a speech that would reshape the world. He called on the Christian warriors of Europe to march to the Holy Land, to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, and to protect the pilgrims who traveled there in faith. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of knights, peasants, and nobles took up the cross, motivated by religious fervor, the promise of land, and the full remission of their sins. For years later, in 1099, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. The slaughter was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe blood running through the streets up to the ankles of the horses. The city, sacred to 3 faiths, had been taken by force, and now it had to be held. But holding the Holy Land was a different kind of war. The road from the coast to Jerusalem were long, treacherous, and filled with bandits. Pilgrims who had traveled thousands of miles from Europe arrived exhausted and vulnerable, and many were robbed, killed, or enslaved before they ever reached the holy city. Something had to be done. It was in this context that a French knight named Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. He and 8 companion knights would dedicate themselves as a religious military brotherhood to protecting the pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. They would take monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They would live by a strict rule, and they would fight. Baldwin agreed, and he gave them something extraordinary in return. Quarters inside the royal palace on the Temple Mount, the site believed to sit directly above the ruins of King Solomon's temple. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The world would come to know them simply as the Knights Templar. What happened next is where history becomes mystery. Because for the first 9 years of their existence, these 9 knights did almost nothing that matched their stated mission. There are virtually no records of them escorting pilgrims, patrolling roads, or fighting bandits during this entire period. What there are records of, though scarce and carefully obscured, are excavations, digging, tunneling, work being done deep beneath the Temple Mount itself. Medieval chronicler and Archbishop of Tyre, William, would later write with a kind of careful vagueness that the knights had been given a specific permission by the king, a permission to dig. He does not say what they were looking for. He does not say what they found. But the physical evidence has never fully disappeared. In the 19th century, a group of British military engineers conducting a survey beneath the Temple Mount discovered a series of tunnels running directly beneath what had been the Templar headquarters. In those tunnels, they found medieval artifacts, a spur, pieces of a Templar lance, a small Templar cross. Someone had been down there, and whoever it was had gone to extraordinary lengths to leave very little trace. The question that has haunted historians, theologians, conspiracy theorists, and archaeologists for centuries is simple and terrifying. What were they looking for? And more importantly, did they find it? The answer requires understanding what was believed to be hidden beneath that ground. According to ancient Jewish tradition, the Temple of Solomon, built in the 10th century before the Common Era, was not merely a magnificent building. It was the house of God on earth. Inside its innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, rested the Ark of the Covenant, the chest containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a sample of the manna from the wilderness. The Ark was not just a religious artifact. It was described in the Hebrew Scriptures as a weapon of God, capable of leveling armies, striking down those who touched it without authorization, and communicating the direct will of the divine. When the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 586 before the Common Era, the Ark disappeared. Some traditions say it was taken to Babylon. Others say it was hidden by the priests before the city fell. Still others claim it was buried beneath the Temple Mount itself, in a series of chambers constructed precisely for the purpose of concealing it from any conqueror. There is a passage in the second book of Maccabees that states Jeremiah, the prophet, hid the ark in a cave on the mountain where Moses had seen the promised land, and that the location would remain unknown until the time God had chosen to gather his people again. But other, older traditions, some preserved in Talmudic writings and in the mystical texts of the Kabbalah, point to a different location. Beneath the foundation stone, beneath the Temple Mount itself. If the Templar Knights knew of these traditions, and there is good reason to believe they did, then their 9 years of excavation were not random. They were a search, a precise, deliberate, extraordinary search for the most sacred and most dangerous object in human history. But the Ark of the Covenant is only one possibility. Some historians and researchers have argued that what the Templars discovered was something equally explosive but entirely different in nature. Documents, texts, written evidence that would have shaken the foundations of Christian theology to its core. The first century of the Common Era was a period of extraordinary religious turmoil in Judea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, revealed the existence of Jewish religious communities in the region whose beliefs differed dramatically from the established temple cult. Early Christian communities similarly preserved documents, letters, and testimonies that were later excluded from the official canon of Scripture, not because they were considered false, but because they were considered dangerous to the emerging institutional church. Some scholars have proposed that beneath the Temple Mount, in the same chambers where the Ark may have been hidden, there existed a library, texts dating to the time of Jesus, documents that recorded events and teachings that the official church had spent centuries suppressing, texts that described a human teacher rather than a divine one, letters that told a different story of the resurrection, records of early Christian communities that practiced rituals entirely unlike those of the medieval Catholic Church. If the Templars found such documents, it would explain everything. Their extraordinary confidence in the face of papal authority, their strange theological independence, the unusual rituals they were later accused of practicing, and most importantly, the iron grip of silence they maintained about what lay beneath the Temple Mount. Because men who know a secret that can destroy an institution are men who hold power over that institution. And for nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar held a kind of power that no military order had ever possessed before. Their rise was almost supernatural in its speed. In 1129, the Council of Troyes officially recognized the Templars as a legitimate religious order, granting them a formal rule written in large part by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen in all of Europe. Bernard's support was not casual. He wrote a passionate treatise in their defense called In Praise of the New Knighthood, in which he described the Templar as a new kind of warrior, one who killed not for earthly glory but for the glory of God, and whose death in battle was not murder but martyrdom. With Bernard's endorsement, donations flooded in from across Europe. Land, money, castles, estates. Noble families competed to give. Young men of the highest social standing competed to join. Within a generation, the Templars had grown from 9 men living in a ruined stable to an international organization with thousands of knights, sergeants, and lay brothers, properties across France, England, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Crusader states, and an annual income that dwarfed that of most kingdoms. But it was not their military power alone that made them extraordinary. It was their financial system. The Templars essentially invented the modern bank. Before the Templars, moving large sums of money across Europe was a dangerous and nearly impossible task. Roads were filled with bandits. Currencies varied from region to region. A wealthy merchant or a pilgrim setting out on a long journey could be robbed of everything before reaching their destination. The Templars solved this problem with a system of extraordinary simplicity and sophistication. A depositor could walk into any Templar preceptory in Europe, hand over a sum of money or valuables, and receive a letter of credit, a document encoded with the depositor's personal information and the amount of the deposit. Upon arriving at any other Templar preceptory anywhere in the known world, the depositor could present this letter and withdraw the equivalent in local currency, minus a small service fee. It was, in essence, the first international banking network in human history, and it made the Templars not just wealthy, but structurally indispensable to the entire economy of medieval Europe. Kings borrowed from them. Crusading armies were financed by them. The papacy itself kept accounts with them. They were also exempt by papal decree from all local taxation and from all ecclesiastical authority except the Pope himself. They answered to no bishop, no archbishop, no king. They could carry their own priests, hold their own church services, and bury their own dead in consecrated ground even during periods of interdict when the rest of a region was denied the sacraments. This independence was remarkable. It was also, for those who observed it carefully, profoundly suspicious. Why would an organization of warrior monks need such extraordinary protection from oversight? What were they doing that required such careful insulation from scrutiny? The answers came, or appeared to come, in the confessions extracted after their arrest. And those confessions are among the most disturbing documents in the history of the medieval church. By the early years of the 14th century, the political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically. The Crusader states in the Holy Land had been lost. The fall of Acre in 1291 had effectively ended the crusading era, and with it, the Templars' primary military justification for existence. The order continued to function as a banking institution and a landed power, but it was increasingly perceived as an anachronism. Its wealth was enormous. Its privileges were vast, and it no longer had a war to fight. Into this situation stepped King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, though his beauty was the only fair thing about him. Philip was intelligent, ruthless, and perpetually broke. His wars and his ambitions had drained the French treasury. He had already moved against the Jews of France, expelling them in 1306 and seizing their assets. He had fought an extended and humiliating conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, which had ended with the Pope's arrest and death and the installation of a French-controlled papacy in Avignon. He was a man who understood that wealth and power could be taken from those who could not defend themselves, as long as the taking was dressed in the language of righteousness. The Templars had both wealth and vulnerability. Their vulnerability was their secrecy. The Templar initiation ceremony was conducted in private, behind closed doors, and new initiates were sworn to absolute silence about what occurred within. This secrecy was standard practice for religious and chivalric orders of the period. But in the hands of Philip's agents, it became a weapon. Rumors had existed for years, fed by former members who had been expelled or who had left the order under unhappy circumstances. The rumors spoke of strange rituals during initiation, of candidates being required to spit on the cross, to deny Christ 3 times, to receive an obscene kiss on the mouth, the navel, or the base of the spine from the officer conducting the ceremony. They spoke of the worship of an idol called Baphomet, a bearded head of ambiguous form, to which the knights allegedly attributed their military success and their financial prosperity. They spoke of the endorsement of sodomy among the brothers as a means of bonding and loyalty. Whether these rumors were true, partially true, distorted versions of actual practices, or entirely fabricated by Philip's agents is a question that has never been definitively resolved. What is certain is that Philip used them. On September the 13th, 1307, sealed orders were delivered to every royal official in France. They were not to be opened until the early morning hours of Friday, October the 13th. When they were opened, they contained instructions to arrest every Templar in France simultaneously, to seize all Templar properties, and to hold the prisoners for examination by agents of the Inquisition. In the pre-dawn darkness of that Friday, across the entire Kingdom of France, the arrests began. The speed and coordination of the operation were extraordinary. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was arrested in Paris along with 60 of his senior officers. Hundreds of other Templars were seized across the country within hours. The surprise was nearly total. What followed was a systematic campaign of torture. The tools available to the Inquisition were not metaphorical. The strappado, in which a prisoner's arms were tied behind their back and they were hoisted off the ground by their wrists, dislocating both shoulders. The rack, sleep deprivation, starvation, isolation, and the most feared of all, the threat and the reality of burning, applied with increasing intensity until the prisoner said whatever the interrogator needed to hear. Under these conditions, confessions came. The vast majority of the arrested Templars, including Jacques de Molay himself, confessed to some or all of the accusations. They had denied Christ during initiation. They had spat on the cross. Some admitted to obscene kisses. Some admitted to the worship of Baphomet. Jacques de Molay would later claim, publicly, that his confession had been false, extracted by torture. Several other senior Templars did the same. But under the rules of the Inquisition, retracting a confession was considered a relapse into heresy, a crime punishable by death. On March the 18th, 1314, on a small island in the Seine River in Paris, Jacques de Molay was burned alive. According to accounts written in the decades that followed, the Grand Master faced the flames with a composure that stunned the assembled crowd. He reportedly called out from the fire that those who had condemned him unjustly would be called before God to answer within the year, that both Pope Clement V and King Philip the Fair would follow him to death before the year was out. Pope Clement V died 33 days later. King Philip IV of France died before the year was over. Whether this was coincidence, the fulfillment of a dying man's curse, or a carefully constructed piece of Templar mythology created after the fact, it became one of the most enduring legends of the medieval period. And it carried a message that no one who heard it could easily dismiss. The Templars had possessed power that ordinary men did not possess, and that power had not died with their Grand Master. The official story of the Templars ends with their formal dissolution by Pope Clement V at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Their properties were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order. Their surviving members were to be absorbed into other orders or to live out their days in monastic houses. The order was over, but the treasure was never found. This is perhaps the single most tantalizing thread in the entire Templar story. When Philip's agents arrived at the Paris Temple, the order's principal stronghold in France and one of the largest financial institutions in the world, they found the vaults largely empty. The Templar fleet, which had been based at the port of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast, had disappeared. Ships, gold, and an unknown quantity of documents and relics had simply vanished. Where did they go? The most persistent theory leads to Scotland. In 1307, Scotland was effectively outside the reach of both the French crown and the papacy. King Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated, which meant that papal orders carried no legal weight in his kingdom. The country was also deeply engaged in its war of independence against England, and experienced military knights arriving with resources would have been received very differently in Edinburgh than in Paris. There is a tradition, supported by partial evidence and heated scholarly debate, that a significant group of Templars fled to Scotland, bringing their treasure and their secrets with them, and that they fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, the very year of de Molay's execution, helping Robert the Bruce achieve his decisive victory over the English forces of King Edward II. The evidence for this is fragmentary. There are no contemporary Scottish chronicles that mention Templar participation at Bannockburn, but there are later traditions, local legends, and a significant number of grave markers in Scottish churchyards bearing iconography that is distinctly Templar in character, but dating to the years after the order's supposed dissolution. Most intriguingly, there is Rosslyn Chapel. Built between 1446 and 1484 by William Sinclair, 1st Earl of Orkney, Rosslyn Chapel is one of the most extraordinary buildings in the British Isles. Its interior is carved with a density and complexity of symbolic imagery that has no parallel in any other church of the period. There are carvings of plants native to the Americas, carved decades before Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage in 1492. There are geometric patterns drawn from Kabbalistic mysticism, Islamic architecture, and early Christian iconography, all woven together in stone. And beneath the chapel, according to persistent local tradition backed by ground-penetrating radar surveys, there are sealed vaults. Some researchers have proposed that Rosslyn is the final resting place of the Templar treasure, including documents and relics possibly connected to what the Knights found beneath the Temple Mount. The Sinclair family has repeatedly declined to excavate, citing concerns about structural stability, and perhaps something else, something less easily named. The legacy of the Templars is inseparable from the legends that grew around them, because those legends speak to something that every generation rediscovers in a slightly different form. The possibility that the official history is incomplete, that somewhere in a vault beneath a chapel, in a tunnel beneath a mountain, in a decoded manuscript in a private collection, there exists knowledge that would change everything. The Baphomet figure has been reinterpreted so many times that its original meaning, if it ever had one, has been almost entirely obscured. To the Inquisition, it was an idol of demon worship. To 19th century occultists, it became a symbol of the union of opposites, male and female, dark and light, material and spiritual. To 20th century conspiracy theorists, it became evidence of satanic influence within secret societies. To modern scholars, it may have been nothing more than a misunderstanding of the Arabic phrase Abu Muhammad, a pronunciation of Muhammad, suggesting that the Templars' long years in the Holy Land had exposed them to Islamic mystical traditions, and that some of what they brought back was a syncretic theology that blended Christian, Jewish, and Islamic elements into something entirely new. That possibility, perhaps more than any other, is what made them truly dangerous to the established order. Because the medieval church rested on one absolute claim: the uniqueness and exclusivity of the Christian revelation. The idea that a group of warrior monks had spent decades in the Holy Land, in proximity to Muslim Sufi brotherhoods and Jewish scholars, and had emerged with the conviction that the truth was larger and stranger and more universal than any single tradition had imagined. That idea was not merely heresy. It was an existential threat. The Templars stood at the intersection of the three great Abrahamic faiths. They had literally seen the holiest ground in the world through the eyes of all three traditions simultaneously. And what they had found there, whether it was an object, a document, or simply a perspective, had transformed them into something that the medieval world had no category for. They were men who knew too much. And in the end, that was their crime. Not the obscene kisses, not the Baphomet, not the denials of Christ that so scandalized their accusers. The real charge against the Knights Templar was that they had gone beneath the surface of the sacred and found something there that could not be unseen. And that knowledge, whatever its precise contents, was simply too dangerous for the world they lived in to allow it to survive. Jacques de Molay burned. The records were sealed. The treasure disappeared. The order was dissolved. But the questions remain. They remain because human beings cannot accept the possibility that the most important things are unknowable. We dig the way those 9 knights dug because we sense that beneath the surface of what we are told, beneath the official record and the sanctioned history, there is something waiting to be found. Something that was hidden for a reason. Something that someone, somewhere, at some point in history, was willing to commit extraordinary violence to keep buried. The Templars went beneath the Temple of Solomon and came back changed. What they found there we may never know with certainty. But the fact that so much effort was made to ensure we would never know is itself the most compelling testimony that it was real. Some secrets are kept not because they are shameful. They are kept because they are true. And truth, in the wrong hands, or perhaps in the right ones, has always been the most dangerous thing in the world. The story of a Knights Templar is not over. It is not over because the vaults beneath Rosslyn Chapel remain sealed. It is not over because the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem have not been fully explored. It is not over because somewhere in the Vatican archives, in collections that were partially open to researchers only in 2003, there are documents from the Templar trials that have still not been fully published. Every generation that encounters this story feels the same pull. The same suspicion that the world we think we know is built on a foundation that someone, long ago, chose very carefully for us. Those 9 knights knew something, and they paid for knowing it with everything they had. The only question that remains is whether we are brave enough to keep digging. These men were not myths. They were soldiers, bankers, mystics, and martyrs. They built the foundations of the modern world in secret and were erased from it in a single night. Their crime was not heresy. Their crime was knowing. And the silence they left behind echoes louder than anything their enemies ever said about them. The Templars did not disappear. They were buried. And some things buried deep enough become the ground we stand on without ever knowing it. If this story reached something in you, if you felt that pull toward the hidden and the unspoken, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment below telling us which mystery you want us to uncover next. Every like, every subscription, every comment tells us that there are still people out there who want the real story. And we are here to tell it.